In this video, I'll be showing you how to set up a chromatography column, and then we'll be using it to purify a sample of acetylferrocene and ferrocene. If you watched our video on TLC analysis, we found that the separation of these two compounds was best achieved with a 25% ethyl acetate and hexane solution, and so that's what we'll be using for our chromatography column. If you haven't watched this video yet, I strongly suggest you watch it before proceeding with this video. To begin with, we're going to dissolve up our sample in a small amount of the eluent. You only need about 1 ml, and you don't want to use too much sample. The smaller the volume, the better it will separate on the column. I'm just adding in 1 ml to our sample. I'll put this aside to dissolve while we set up our column. Obtain yourself a chromatography column that is nice and dry and is secured by 2 clamps. You also need a rack of test tubes to collect your fractions. To begin with, we need to measure out the right amount of silica. In our labs, we'll be using a 15 centimetre column, which I've marked here with a black texter. To begin with, we pour the dry silica into our column to see how much we need. It is important that this is done inside a fume hood, as you'll notice that the silica gel is extremely fluffy and dusty and will cause breathing irritation and hazards. It doesn't need to be exactly 15 centimetres. A couple of centimetres either side won't make too much of a difference. But you don't want to put too much, otherwise it will take way too long to run your column. Next, you want to pour out your measured silica into a clean conical flask. We do this because if you add solvent directly to your column, you'll trap air bubbles in your column, which will affect your separation. I'll show you an example of this later on. Again, make sure this is done inside the fume hood so you don't get dust out in the environment. Okay, so next we need to wet our silica. Using the least polar solvent of your mixture, so in our case it'll be hexane, not ethyl acetate, we want to add about 50 to 100 ml of solvent. The exact amount doesn't matter too much, you just want to make sure that you have enough to mobilize the silica. The silica doesn't actually get dissolved in this mix, but you want to make sure that it becomes mobile. You can see initially that it is stuck to the sides or to the bottom of the flask, and with careful swirling you can get it all mobile. Okay, now that we're completely mobile, we can add it back into our chromatography column. Before you do this, make sure that your tap is closed. Just give your solution a quick swirl before pouring just to remobilize the silica and add it to the column. You'll notice that the silica is stuck to the side of the flask, and so you can rinse that with a bit more hexane. Again, giving it a swirl to mobilize the silica and pouring it onto the column. Put your flask underneath the column to collect your solvent and open the tap. You'll see that the silica will begin to start packing in your column and you'll have an excess of solvent. You'll also notice that there's a bit of silica stuck to the side of our column. Again, using the hexane and a pipette, you can wash down the sides of your funnel and your column to wash all the silica down to the bottom. Okay, you'll notice as the silica is packing that the flow is probably getting slower and slower. To speed this up, we can use a tubing with an adapter to attach to the end of the column, and then the other end is usually connected either to a nitrogen line or a hand pump to apply pressure to the column. When you apply pressure to a column, it's known as flash chromatography. You want to make sure that the amount of pressure you put is not too great that the end will pop right off. So as I apply pressure, you'll notice that the speed of the column will travel faster and the silica is starting to pack down. You want to push all that remaining solvent down to the very top of the column without running it dry. And you'll notice that I still have a bit more silica stuck to the side of the column. Once you have packed your column and gotten a nice flat surface, you want to make sure that you don't disturb that nice flat surface or it will affect your separation. So make sure when you're washing the sides down that the solvent runs down the edges of the column and not directly onto the column. Again, I'm applying a bit of pressure to speed up the process. Okay. And now I have no solvent at the top of my column. However, I haven't run it dry that there's air bubbles starting to appear. Close the tap and we're now ready to load our sample.